Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. If this is your first stop by my channel, I've been sewing since I was about 8 years old, I have a fashion degree, and I've been a high school fashion teacher. So it's easy to say I know my way around a sewing machine. Today I'm going to walk you through all the absolute basics that you need to know to be able to get your sewing machine up and running. It's important for me to share that in sewing, everybody kind of has their own style. So the things I'm going to share with you today are not only technical, but little tips and tricks that I've picked up from all my years of sewing. Please take with you what works for you and feel free to leave behind what doesn't. So I'm going to start out here by just explaining the absolute basics of how a sewing machine works. A sewing machine has two sources of thread. It has a source of thread up at the top here, and then it has a source of thread at the bottom called the bobbin. Now you thread the source of thread at the top through the machine and it comes down through the needle here, and then the bobbin thread comes up through the bottom. Now when you actually go to sew a garment or sew a seam, this needle is going to go down through the fabric and it actually catches the bobbin thread, creates a loop around it, and then comes back up. So basically you're getting the two threads to interlock with each other, and that's how it holds your seam together. So I also think it's important to point out that almost all sewing machines have the same basic function to them. There may be some sewing machines that have, special bells and whistles, like different stitch functions. They may be computerized. They might be built for like a specific task, like doing really great buttonholes or bindings. But a basic sewing machine like this one, its job is to sew a straight line and sew a zigzag and do a buttonhole. Those are like the three main things you're gonna need to do with this sewing machine. And I'm gonna point out the features on this sewing machine that you really would find on any sewing machine, even though they might look a little bit different. Starting with the right side of the machine, we have this guy right here, and this is your hand wheel. The hand wheel can be turned forward and back, and that's how you manually can have your needle go up and down, and how you can also make the pelican head show through the top of the machine when you're threading. But these three guys right here, these are three things that are going to be on every single machine that you use, no matter what. This right here is your stitch choice. So this is going to tell the machine, what stitch do I want to sew with right now? I might be sewing with a straight stitch, which is right here on my wheel. I might be sewing with a zigzag stitch. I might want to turn it to, say, a buttonhole stitch. This machine comes with a couple different choices. It comes with maybe 16 or so that I could use. Some nice scalloping, maybe for the edge of a dress. But a lot of more computerized machines will come with maybe 60 to 80 to 100 different kinds of stitches. Really depends on what your goal is and what you're trying to accomplish with sewing. But for me, in my daily life, this kind of machine with just a really small amount of stitches does exactly what I need. So right above our stitch choice is our stitch length wheel. And basically what this wheel does is it tells the machine how long or how short we want our stitches to be as we sew. Now this becomes important depending on, again, what you're trying to accomplish right then and there. Most of the time, if you're sewing like a garment, or as many of you are right now sewing masks, you're gonna hang out at a 3. That's like your average stitch length. You would come all the way up to a 4 when you're doing something called a basting stitch, which is a really loose stitch that you just put to kind of hold something in place and you plan to take it out later. You may come down to a 2 when you want to do a stay stitch. It's a really, really tight stitching that's used a lot in collars. And then you come down to these really small stitches that are between a 1 and a 0. And if you can see here, there's a little buttonhole mark there. And that's basically telling you that you really only use those stitch lengths when you're making buttonholes, which is those really, really, really tiny little stitches that kind of wrap around the edge of the fabric to keep it from fraying. So again, you're gonna kind of hang out just in that 3 zone there. On top of the machine on the right hand side, we have a knob here that goes from numbers 0 all the way through 6, and it says right next to it, that's our stitch width. So when you're sewing just a straight line, your stitch width doesn't really come into play because the needle isn't going side to side. The only difference it makes on my particular machine is if the stitch width is turned all the way up and I am sewing a straight stitch, it'll bring the needle all the way to the left-hand side of the presser foot, which I usually want to be sewing in the center. So to bring that needle back to center, I just go ahead, I make sure this is turned all the way down. I like to tell people that if you are trying to get a sewing machine up and running and you're very new, make sure you check these 3 things. These could be an issue. If you got it maybe set to a buttonhole and you didn't know it and you're wondering why it's not being pulled through at the rate that you want it to be. Maybe you've got it set to one of these specialty stitches. So if you're trying to just get your machine up and running and do some simple work, just you're sewing for the first time, you wanna just check, make sure your stitch choice is on a straight line. We're gonna make sure our length is at a 3, and we're gonna make sure our width is at a 0. And the last guy we've got on the right-hand side of the machine right here is, this is how we thread the bobbin. So remember when I was talking about the 2 different sources of threading, you have your thread on top, and you have this little teeny spool called the bobbin. If you're needing to thread that bobbin or put thread onto that bobbin, you're gonna go ahead, you're gonna put it on this guy here. It wraps around here, and then the thread goes here, and it'll spin the bobbin for you. If you've never spun a bobbin before, please go ahead and check out my video on how to thread a bobbin. But another source of grief on a sewing machine can be an improperly threaded bobbin. If your bobbin is threaded like with all sorts of knots and jumbles and it doesn't look smooth, then it's not gonna be fed through the machine properly, and it's just gonna give you a lot of problems. So over on the other side of the machine, we have even more important features to take a look at. This guy right here that says reverse, and it gives you a little symbol of a reverse sign there. When you push it down, it's gonna make the machine go backwards. So normally when you sew this direction, but it's gonna make the feed dogs bring your fabric back this way. Why would you need to do that? Well, there's several instances where you would need to do that depending on what you're making, but the #1 reason that you need this guy is for something called backstitching. And what backstitching is it's starting your seam by going backwards first and then coming forward. And what that does is it locks your seam in place. So when you go to press it or you go to move on to another part of the project, that seam doesn't come apart. So 2 more adjustment wheels we have up top here. This one is to move the needle side to side. Normally you don't really need to move the needle out of center. You'd only need to do that when you're either like sewing in a zipper or you need to get really close to a seam for a specific reason. But for basic sewing, you really don't need to worry about moving your needle out of center. This guy is the tension wheel. Now the tension wheel is important because the tension wheel tells the sewing machine how hard or how not hard to pull the thread as it gets threaded through here. That's important because if your tension is too low, then your stitches are gonna just come out like really loose. They're not gonna look right. If your tension is too high, the stitches are gonna be like really tight and your fabric's gonna pucker. So you have to make sure that the tension is correct for the type of fabric that you're using. Now, if you're just using a plain cotton, which is what most people start out with, then a tension between a 3 and a 5 is probably your best bet. And you can see on my machine, it's actually marked right in there, 3 to 5, to kind of indicate like, this is your sweet spot. This is where you want to live. You would either turn it up or down if you go to a specialty fabric like a chiffon, a spandex, or a velvet. So if you go into those realms, make sure you do your research and figure out what tension you should be on that's going to give you the best stitching quality possible. Now that we've got a zoomed in picture of where our needle is, I'm going to point out a couple key features down here. I'm going to start out with this guy. This is known as the presser foot. And what the presser foot does is it puts a little bit of pressure on your fabric. It can go up or down. So I'm taking the switch back here, moving it up and down. You want to make sure it's always in the down position while you're sewing. And it's going to help make sure that your fabric gets pulled evenly through the machine by these little guys under here. And these are known as the feed dogs. The feed dogs are what pulls the fabric through. So back to what we were talking about the stitch length. The stitch length, when we adjust it down or up, tells these guys how fast or how slow to pull that fabric through the machine. Now the cool thing about presser feet is there's tons of different presser feet out there. This is a really standard one, but you can get different presser feet for different types of zippers. You can get presser feet that will be better for stretch, that put elastic in for you, that make bindings for you. It's endless, but you can get really lost down a rabbit hole of different types of presser feet. But anyway, the big thing to take away from right here is when you're sewing, presser foot is always down. And the other big important thing to learn about this area is this is where your bobbin lives. So we were talking about the bobbin before. The bobbin is the small thread that goes into the bottom of the machine. It lives in what's called the bobbin housing in here. If I can get her out, yep, like that. She needs to be spinning in the clockwise direction. And she needs to be clicked into this little slot right here. And so I would say as a teacher, 90% of the issues that I see from students when they come to me and they say, my sewing machine's not sewing properly, I'm getting like bubbles and little jumbles of thread, it's here. Check this first. Make sure it's clicked in, make sure your bobbin is spun well, the tension's nice and smooth while you're spinning it and it's nice and smoothly wound, and make sure that it's spinning the right direction. Like I said, 90% of problems are gonna come from right here. You can actually also hear it too when you've been sewing for a long time if this is not clicked in. So when I hear a student sewing and then they come talk to me and say, you know, it's not working, I can hear it immediately and they're always so impressed that I can hear it. But when you've been sewing for a long time, you can just hear that this bobbin is not laced properly and you need to go back and rethread it. So next I'm going to show you just kind of some basic stitches and proper hand position while you're sewing through the machine. I already have my machine threaded, so if you do not know how to thread the machine, please make sure you go back and watch my video on exactly how to thread the machine first before you try to sew, because you want to make sure that your thread is in the proper place, or else this guy is just never going to work for you. So I'm going to show you just a plain straight line. If you remember, we had the stitch length on 3, we have the width on 0, we have the stitch selection chosen at a straight stitch. So I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna sew here. It's gonna be a little bit loud, I apologize, but I want you to hear that the machine is nice and smooth. You don't hear any kind of like grinding or catching. If you start to hear weird noises like that, something's not threaded properly. The other really important thing I want you to note here is I don't pull the fabric through. If you start pulling the fabric through, you're gonna get warping, the stitches aren't gonna be even and nice and smooth. You wanna just make sure you let the dogs do their job, and then you use this hand just to guide it, and then you can bring in your left hand if you need a little extra stability, but usually use your right hand just to go ahead. You're gonna guide that fabric through, let the machine do its job. Now I'm gonna show you what the stitch length looks like turned all the way up. Turn it down to about a 1.5 because I want you to see the difference. Wow, look how much slower that's going. So a lot of times when people say, oh, my machine's not sewing fast enough or like not going farther enough, usually means you got to take a look at your stitch length. And then remember what we talked about before, anytime you're starting or you're finishing a seam, we're gonna hit that back stitch. And I went backwards a little bit. All it does is it locks your seam in place so your threads don't fray. So let's check out our straight line stitch sample here. You can see right here, this is where I was on a length 3, and it's really nice and smooth. The fabric's not puckered, the stitches are even. If we were to flip it over to the back, it looks exactly the same. So if you flip it to the back and you see too much of one side of the thread on either side, you got to go back to that tension. You've got to adjust it a bit and see where it's pulling either too hard or too loose. If you see here in the middle, see how the stitches get a little bit bigger, and that's where I had the length turned all the way up to a 4. And then right here at the end, see it's like really tight, and that's where it was turned up all the way. It was turned down to a 2 there. And then right here you can see, I'm gonna bring it a little closer so you guys can see it. That's my back stitch, and that's when I hit the reverse button and made sure to lock my stitch in place by sewing in a backwards direction. I'm also going to show you how the zigzag stitch works. I've got now my width set to 6, which is the widest width my machine will do. I've got it back to a length of 3, and I've got the stitch selection at a zigzag. So as you can see here, when I go through, the needle starts jumping from side to side, and it creates a zigzag for us. That's at my widest right there. That's pretty wide. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna turn it down to like a 4, and I'm actually gonna turn my stitch length down to a 2. Much smaller zigzag. If I wanna get even tighter than that, I can turn it down to a 1. Really tight zigzag there. So lots of different adjustments you can make to accommodate whatever project you're working on. And here's our zigzag stitch sample. Again, you can see where my length was at a 3 and my width was turned all the way up, so that's as wide as my machine goes at a 6. I believe I turned it down to a 4 or so, and then I turned the length down here to, I believe, a stitch length of 2. So you can see all the differences in how adjusting those settings will give you different things depending on what project you're working on. Hopefully with the skills you've learned in this video, you're ready to start operating your sewing machine. There's many more things you can learn about your sewing machine, but these basics will at least get you started. Thanks again for stopping by my channel, Meghan Grace DIY. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them below. And as always, if you're not a subscriber, help my channel grow by hitting that subscribe button. Happy sewing!